Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. Let's get the icon right. For those of you who are here, this is going to be a reflection on the past 2 years. We're coming up on 2 years here at Varn Blog since I got frustrated and started recording these in my basement during the height of COVID. I've been traveling across the United States recently, mostly to take care of family issues. As my hair gets longer, you can see it's gray in it. And I'm at the time period where one begins to have to deal with aging parents, dying parents, dead parents. And so I have been taking care of that. And that has involved traveling back through Michigan and Georgia. And I was struck by the feast or famine nature of a lot of the East Coast. Now, things are bad out here, and it's not like there's no poverty in the West, and it's actually weirdly coexistent in places like California, where you can see opulent wealth everywhere and also massive homelessness. That's not how things work so much in a lot of these, quote, red states, or even purple states like Georgia and Michigan. What one sees is actually some communities which have industries coming in somewhat randomly, being full of upper middle class homes, and other areas being utterly decimated, both within the city, but also in suburban and rural areas. One thing that you've encountered when I was driving through Georgia are black towns that are rural, but mostly black, and totally forgotten in our discussions about racialized poverty. The infrastructure is gone. They have no small businesses, and yet they also don't have most of the advantages of the, quote, urban areas. They are strategically left out of our discussions about this. This became true when I traveled through places like Dublin, Georgia, or Twiggs County, Georgia. These are not areas like North Georgia, where Marjorie Taylor Greene comes from, that are majority white. They're also not areas that are necessarily progressive. They didn't necessarily vote for Biden in 2020, actually. In fact, the biggest growth of that population was, yes, Atlanta and the quote urban areas of Georgia, which always vote Democratic and have since the Dixiecrats went away. But that there's an expansion in the suburbs with immigrants and college-educated white office workers outside of Atlanta and Savannah, and outside of the Air Force Base in Warner Robins. Now, I've been accused of being vague in the past, and this reflection of traveling through Georgia and then also traveling through Michigan and places like Lansing and Ann Arbor, and seeing places where public infrastructure is just utterly falling apart. Roads are a mess. They're poorly designed. They're designed for different capacity than it currently exists there. There's 1,000 strip malls, but none of the public infrastructure really support those malls. And the office space, etc., is just sitting there about to go fallow. I've been thinking about what that means for the left right now, and some polls that came out in 2022. Now, I've cited them in the past, and I'll try to dig them up and put them in the show notes again. But socialism has lost popularity since 2018. It's still more popular than it's been at any other time prior, but it's declined, and so has capitalism. Because none of these ideologies seem to actually speak to what most people are experiencing. And the cheap tricks that a lot of people who are involved in these kind of partisan movements, like let's make the Democrats socialist question again, ever, movements kind of miss out on. Pushes for things like state level single payer, which is not going to work because currency limitations. States don't have currency sovereignty. Or urban improvements that ignore the fact that a lot of left mayoral candidates who try to do left policy through the mayorship fail because they're disciplined by bond markets, as my friend Josiah Richter has pointed out. You'll just have the bond rating of the city downgraded and their ability to fund themselves runs out. There are all kinds of capital discipline mechanisms that the left just ignores because it doesn't understand them. It doesn't look at them. It takes the easy route and looks at national politics and looks at national politics in terms of campaigns, of canvassing, etc. Has a hard time even understanding things like contract negotiations and why a group may choose to strike or not strike when the unions are nominally rich. Notice I said nominally rich. A lot of the unions right now are sitting on massive asset piles, but most of those assets are tied into land ownership, which is not easily valorizable, meaning you can't easily turn it into liquidity to support even a strike. So even if they wanted to, they probably can't turn all that into liquid goods. Now they can probably take loans out, etc., but there's all kinds of ways in which they, again, would be disciplined by the open market if they did too much of that. Which is not to say it's impossible to fix, and it's not to say we should excuse what unions aren't doing. But if you want to understand why, despite all the talk of union growth in the past 2 years, why they aren't really growing, you have to look at this. And what does the left do right now? It wants a historic confrontation with right-wing forces. But it's also not willing to look at the fact that it's supported people that do not respect it and don't feel that it needs to even make trade deals with it. A friend of mine asked me what we should make of the Democratic Party elites who are unwilling to throw any concessions to someone like Cornel West, who calls Cornel West's campaign to lose validity. All right. This is what FDR did, by the way. I mean, this is something that you need to understand. FDR's genius, and what, you know, there's a school of social democrats who really think he's a genius and make him the hero of the progressive democratic socialist wing of the American Party, where I think he was basically a Bonapartist figure. But what he did was to see that there's real threats to Democratic party power on the horizon. And he actually made trade-offs to keep the Democratic Party elites existent, but also realized that he had to give things to the populist and the socialist that existed before him. Now, this was not, properly speaking, labor politics. This was the co-option of labor politics, but it did achieve real things. The National Labor Relations Act, large parts of the new bill, banking stability, etc. These things were good for capital, but they were also good for workers. Were they the best for workers? No, and I actually agree with Paul Maddox Sr. on a lot of the limitations ultimately of this program. But it showed that because there was a mass movement that was real, because it had previously shown itself to be occupied. Remember that one of the biggest battles the socialists ever did was battling it out with Wilson, a Democrat. The last thing FDR wanted was that kind of thing to happen again. So he would make trade-offs. But the Biden administration, for all of their adoption of progressive rhetoric, has actually been fairly conservatizing on the way that it actually approached things. And it does seem like a bait and switch. And for those of you who go, this was necessary to fight the right, I want you to look locally at where the right is. The right is more organized. Its interest groups are larger. There are more people in Moms for Liberty in a year than there have been in DSA in 10. That's a fact. The DSA, meanwhile, has become less and less relevant as people have realized that the obsession over the squad was a red herring. It always was. while people have tried to convince me otherwise, I was right. There's many times where me telling people where I was wrong, but on this one, I was right. From 2018 forward, I said, look at the long history of progressive and left-wing operations within the Democratic Party. That since their constituencies aren't large enough to protect them from either the donor base or already established party elites, they have to play ball. And to play ball, they have to actually accommodate to the status quo. And there's nothing the DSA or anything like that can do about that, because they do not have the size or the capacity to hold these people accountable. The reason why we think the DSA is mass is because the socialist horizons in the United States had collapsed since the early 1960s. That none of us in our lifetimes, unless you're over 60 or 70 years old, remember a time when socialism was on the horizon. And the people who do remember that time take the wrong lessons from it. We should replay the Civil Rights Act, etc. Well, the Civil Rights Act had clear demands that were immediate, even if it was in some ways limited in its scope. And when the civil rights tried to broaden those demands to economic concerns, well, it failed. Some small stake of bourgeois dignity could be tacitly allowed there. But the actual abolition of the conditions undergirding it were not. And we see this even after Black Lives Matter. There's been scandal after scandal with Black Lives Matter organizations. And we have to be honest with the hashtag way of building organizations, where there was no organization, then there was multiple organizations, would of course lead to bad actors and grifting. And the left just doesn't want to talk about that. Right? Either the socialist left or the Democratic Party left. And those are different things. Doesn't want to talk about it because it makes the actionism, the riot form talk, and all this jargon that we heard in the 2000 teens more transparently naive. Yet there's a truth to this, that since there's been an obsession, even in the socialist world, with building socialist institutions that are still pretty much elite institutions. Yes, there's discussion of free higher education, although there's not really any real dealing with how to make the schools better. In fact, there's kind of a denial that they even need to be better in the first place. You might go, oh, well, we don't actually think that. Of course we know. Yeah, but what are you doing about it? The left ceded school battles to culture war issues from the right, but the right was able to get foothold in there because they were speaking to actual dysfunctions in the school system and saying, well, these are dysfunctions are because of these social aesthetics, basically, that we have. Whereas the left wasn't dealing with it at all. And this isn't new, okay? Christopher Lasch was writing about this in the 1980s. And the one thing I got from studying Christopher Lasch and studying the history of the SPA and the CPUSA is that none of this was new. It wasn't even new with the New Left, right? Nor is it purely Western, the more you study the history of, say, the Marxist-Leninist faction battles, which, by the way, people literally killed each other over. Like, we have to remind ourselves of this. Like, there are times where Marxist-Leninist anti-revisionist and Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thoughtist were killing each other in Latin America and even in border skirmishes between the USSR and China. All right? And if you don't think this played out and had a part of the reason why the socialist world largely didn't survive the 1980s when it seemed to be ascendant in 1982 and the 70s. I'm literally reading a book by Alvin Goldner, and from the perspective of the late 70s, it looks like actually the socialist world's about to come into being. And from our post-1992 perspective, which is not even a full generation later, it seems utterly impossible that anyone ever thought that. Now people are trying to gild the lily on so much of this. We have to deal with post-burnout America, and let's go back to those rural towns that I'm talking about. Let's go back to, every third day there's a discussion about the morality of something like a country music song or whatever. And I said in the past that these are moral panics. They probably aren't helping. They aren't helping because they're selective. Like, oh, we care about violence when it shows up in discussions of small town America where it actually doesn't really, where it's not a huge factor because there's not that many people who live in those areas, versus violence in other forms of media, which leftists will defend or at least keep their mouth shut about. Why is that? Why are we selective on that? It's clear why we're selective on that. And that's not unique to the left, all right? Neither is ideological incoherence. There's a way in which gust of popular sentiment and emotivism, and I don't say this to pivot emotions against logic, like I realize they're related, but this kind of purely shooting from the hip attitude, which I used to consider actually a conservative trait. It was actually part of the adaptation strategy of conservative post the 1950s. We don't have ideology. We don't even really have moral sentiments or virtues. We have a kind of pragmatic relation to power. And you see this in the kinds of wild ideological shifts on the right that the left often just misses. And it's right to point out that part of the incoherence is the point, that it's, loyalty to actual real power structures as opposed to any professed ideology, whether it, to go through some of the things we've seen, Reaganism, Ayn Randism, Christian Reconstructionism, which is different than the current frames of Christian nationalism, although the two are definitely related. Tea Partyism, libertarianism, neoconservatism, Randism that combine neoconservatism with libertarianism, paleoconservatism, etc. And one of the things that you learn if you deal with the right a lot is that they're just as socially incohesive as the left, but they're in some ways more socially damaged. And you see this in their projections and their aristocratic fantasies and their self-flattery. But the left has similar problems, which is why it's very hard for it to actually develop a program that isn't just some Bonapartist attachment to a candidate that's unlikely to win and trying to tail that, whether that's RFK Jr., or Cornel West in the current kind of pathetic form, or Bernie, or in the prior pathetic forms, which the current form actually rhymes with from the 90s, late Nader, or Dinesh Kucinich, or even one of the people I supported at one point, Mike Gravel. My experience with the Mike Gravel campaign in 2008 and then what happened with Obama was part of my break with any conventional democratic politics. And ironically, post-Occupy, the last 10 years have been trying to drag us back into that. But what is amazing about all this, all right, and again, to come back to those small towns I'm driving through, is even when you have a place like Jackson, Mississippi, where you have a mayor, the systemic defunding of that city means that Jackson is a hellhole, and it is. All right. I'm sure somebody's going to write me and tell me parts of Jackson is ugly, but in general, it is. It has a murder rate that is like about 10 times the murder rate of the United States, which means it is closer to Honduras's murder rate during a cartel war than it is to even Chicago. I mean, one of the ironies of this that I've been pointing out for a long time is like the left doesn't want to talk about, quote, crime. Now, a lot of criminality shouldn't be criminal in the first place, right? Like there's a lot of, and as I pointed out to people, we have 500 per 100,000 in jail, but the murder rate is 6 per 100,000 on average, which means that you have something like, I don't know, 50 times the actual violent crime rate in prison. So I'm not saying this to support a carceral answer. This is not my pivot towards the right. It's just being fucking honest. The poorest communities, working class and lower, people who aren't even working class, are the people victimized by a lot of this violence. And they're in the cities that are. And while I do not think a carceral or police option will fix this, I want to be clear on that. I also do not think most of the way we talked about, say, defunding the police 6 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, did anything about that, nor did we realistically address the social problems that were unleashed by COVID policy. But we can't even get the Democrats to make concessions to stop Cornel West. There's no movement to get concessions from Biden. In fact, if anything, the criticism of Biden from the left is much less significant than the criticism of Obama from the left. It's just that if younger millennials have just become more conservative without realizing it. No, they're not Republicans, but they've kind of given up. They're gonna go touch grass and engage in their personal journeys. We've seen this shit before, and in this way, the millennial left is actually mirroring its parents. And yes, all these generational markers are approximate. They're not real in like a substantive way, but they're real enough. And in the frustration for this, you see a turn towards foreign policy in a way that we can't affect. All right. A friend of mine's like, well, why don't you talk about foreign policy more? You said you were going to. And my response was, I think a lot of people about this are crazy. And his response was, well, you're too into negative dialectics. And my response to that is like, if we are principled about this, then we have to take a realistic view about this, in which case most of what we're dealing with in this war posturing doesn't make any side look very good. And a lot of the narratives we tell ourselves, including on the left, about what's going on in this foreign policy are not completely true. They're self-propaganda, which is an interesting point. It's like we've drank the Kool-Aid so long that we have to convince ourselves that the Kool-Aid is real, be under the guise of anti-imperialism or whatever, and thus convince ourselves that our moral sentiments that we express have material effects when we haven't built anything to have those material effects. There's no pressure lobby to end the Ukraine war. There's no realistic view of how to come to the table and offer something to end this war, because most of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, which is not democratically responsive, I may add, the entire 20th century was taking democratic accountability away from the administrative agencies in the army, which is one of the reasons why the army still kind of works and is kind of the secret thing holding so much U.S. society together, which is why so many people kind of ignore it. Right? It was even the backdoor way to keep these red state economies and these rural economies up for a long time, until the Bush administration ended that by streamlining the army and ending the largesse in military Keynesianism. And of course, the left is always fighting its prior battles, are looking at stats too simply. because it's too online, too immediate, too responsive, too frankly reactionary. And I don't mean that in a political sense. I mean that it's just reacting. It's going off of your hip. And so the same ideological nomadism develops, because there's no party, no movement, no nothing to hold this together. And yet any attempt to build the party, I'm just going to go say it's premature. You haven't done the work. And what people expect it to do is unrealistic. Yes, we need to deal with the Constitution. Yes, many of the reforms proposed are not good enough. Yes, it's all still developed in an imperialist matrix, but so is everything. Even multipolarity will not get rid of the imperialist matrix. It will just mean that there are more of them. Unless global hegemons and more regional ones. That's all that's been sold as, if you really read what it means. Is that good or bad? It depends. I know people will call me an anti-imperialist or a Putin shill or whatever, and I've been called both for saying that NATO policy and EU policy together put Ukraine in an impossible position, that the internal response from Ukraine itself was a very nationalist one, which empowered very strong right-wing elements, many of whom do have historical ties to the Nazis, but that Russia also played a role in that, and that if Ukraine was bait to get Russia into a war, they took it. And the justifications for it are structurally no different than the justifications given by the Bush administration for, say, the invasion of Iraq and preemptive strikes and preemptive national interest. Now, you may go, well, pragmatically, we can believe in one of this because it's anti-imperial and one of that was pro-imperial. And I'm like, yeah, but the structural argument's the same. And it is. Oh, you're making a absurdly simple reduction. I don't know. I actually don't think so. I think that many of you don't have nuance until it's convenient. But that we should be pushing, honestly and sincerely pushing, for a peace settlement in which both parties get something, and that Russia as a major policy is not used any more face. And the problem with that, and there's nothing that the left in America can do about that right now, is that the U.S. foreign policy, because it is not democratically accountable, are even really accountable to itself. I mean, one of the interesting things about foreign policy right now is the way in which there's lots of divisions within the military itself that we're just not looking at, in regards to, say, China, in regards to, say, Russia, etc. And it sometimes comes up when people listen to, like, the foreign policy weirdos. I call them weirdos. This has been my word lately, but people who express, like, partisan wonk values that are based on certain views of America, where they're John Mersheimer on the right, are Peter Zion in the center, that there is a whole lot you have to unpack and deal with that you learn from these debates by proxy, because they're basically representing different opinions, probably within military brass. You have to have a way to deal with that and tie that down and limit the military and society, or be honest about what it is. Right now, if we have to choose between military and the cops, frankly, I'm going to choose the military most of the time. There are structural reasons for that are beyond the scope of today, but we need to be honest about that. And even that, I'm not really so much sold on, because outsourcing, the military outsourcing things to local militias is definitely what it does abroad. Now, this has been a wide-ranging rant, so let me tie this in. How are you going to rein in the fact that so much of the U.S. society, even down to economic research, is now solely dependent on the military? Particularly when you no longer have a Cold War or any justification that was making it act in a more socially cohesive manner. We have to admit that the Soviet Union, particularly in the first half of the United States, changed the way capitalist states played in a way that was more concessionary to workers. And it wasn't just because the Soviet Union existed, but the Soviet Union proved that it was a real threat at home. But by the middle of the century, even in the great seeming socialist expansion in the 1970s, it was pretty clear that the capitalist powers were no longer afraid of that. They weren't afraid of alienating the workers, putting them out. And now we have an elite, and I'm gonna use the term elite, even though, yes, I realize it's used by right-wingers dishonestly all the time. We can't build all of our politics just on not doing what the right does. That's a stupid politics, and also makes you totally subordinate to the right, because what are you doing? Just not what they do. But I say elites here because it is a bigger problem than just the bourgeoisie or capital ownership. If you want to call it the PMC, fine. I've gone over and over my problems with that, but let's talk about what we mean here. I don't mean anyone with a college degree. I don't just mean anyone who might have some small foothold even into management, or white collar workers, or any of that. I mean people who actually have fiduciary and or managerial power over large sections of society, but may not actually own capital. They may technically be dependent on the labor pool, the wage fund or whatever, but they're still elites, and they still have a lot of social and or political and or actual power. I've been reading people like Peter Turchin and Michael Lind, people whose politics I do not share and who have faith in economic forms that I don't have, both in terms of analysis and in terms of policy. However, there are things that they are right about that we have to deal with. One of which is that our elites have, as policy on the world stage, tried to get everyone to believe that they could be integrated into an elite. Therefore, it incentivized prior groups that were not in white collar labor to go get the training to be in white collar labor, but to do so at their own expense, leading to a massive debt bubble. That's the story of college from the 60s to literally the last 10 years. And it was based off of GI and Cold War, GI Bill and Cold War largesse that dried up a generation ago. And to fix this takes more than just forgiving student debt. You'd have to go in and fix the primary schools. And to fix the primary schools, you can't just fix the schooling. You also have to fix their social context. We've been trying to backdoor do social programs through schools for way too long. But here's also what it doesn't mean, and this is a trend I've seen for progressives a lot in the last decade. It also doesn't mean gaslighting people and telling them it's just okay that you are this thing that has happened to you. Whether or not that's you can't eat healthily because of food cost. So we are not going to try to fix that social anymore. We're just going to say it's okay to be obese. It's genetic. Except that obesity rates have increased. Yes, BMI is bullshit. Yes, you shouldn't shame people. Right? I'm not pro stigmatization or anything like that. I think that this is a problem of capital development, of farm subsidies, etc. It is a problem of making physical labor and physical and even maintaining your body a luxury good, just like we've made marriage a luxury good, etc. You don't believe me? Look at marriage rates. Middle class people marry, poor people don't, but poor people still believe in marriage as an institution. All right. Do they actually practice that? No. And the nuclear family is largely not viable for most people. It doesn't mean they don't want love and pair bonding. They may not want children. But even that is a strange argument. Why don't they want children? Because it's too expensive to raise them? Well, why is that? Right? We have to have answers for this. Now, I'm not a pro or anti-natalist, right? I actually think populations tend to regulate themselves somewhat. And you want them to, because if they don't, then disease and or other things will regulate your population for you. I'm not a Malthusian, but the reason why I'm not a Malthusian is technological. I do actually believe that Malthus was correct about pre-industrial societies. He was using it to have some pretty nasty policies towards the poor and in an industrial society, but nonetheless. Let's stay on focus here, though. The left needs to have an answer to the homeless problem other than let them have encampments. It needs to have an answer to the drug and mental health crisis other than let them eat therapy, for the mental health crisis. Because we can't talk about therapy or therapeutic culture in a monolithic way, but clearly large parts of it are not working. And it affects TikTok and whatnot aspirationally in a way that totally makes sense, but it's probably not helpful because people want those goods. We have to quit telling people that who they are when the alienation they feel is solely their own problem, but not also overpromise. Like, communities are violent and disruptive. You have to deal with that. Many of us would rather be left alone. You have to deal with that too. Some people do like their alienation. You have to deal with that. Why do they like it? That's complicated. It's on a case-by-case basis. I don't even think it's necessarily a bad thing, by the way. What is bad is when there are no options, there's no public places, and we're not incentivized to use them in so much that they do exist. And why aren't we? Well, because we're afraid of the homeless, etc., in a lot of these public areas. We have to deal with that. Honestly. We have to deal with reigning in the military. We have to deal with the fact that we have collectively as a society in the United States and in the West as a whole, specifically, even if you're not from the U.S., the U.S. military dominate even most primary science research. We have to deal with the fact that mutual aid, as we practice it, cannot deal with the scale of cost because of the complexity of our own society. I can't donate small things to keep a family running in the working class, except for the very, very poor. We have to quit treating the working class or any of the class as if it's stupid, but also quit trying to flatter it by following the people who flatter those people, are pretending that there is not problems in these class things, or that poverty isn't doing damage, because it is. We are 2 years beyond the burnout. We are a decade past Occupy. And it feels like we learned almost no lessons, not just from the new left and its failure and similar burnout pattern from the 60s into the 1980s, but also from ourselves, that we haven't learned much. And that we've actually become more complacent, more forgiving, more self-effacing, more narcissistic, more interested in the superficial declarations of values and what's going on culturally than actually changing the underlying problems that created this in the first place. We aren't interested in that because it's hard. And if we are interested in that, I'm using we here very loosely before you come at me. If you are one of the individuals actually interested in that, what are you doing to build something towards that? Are you building another political cargo cult? There's plenty already. That's what happens when the left fails in its mass movements, is cargo cults and sectarian things replace them. And that's not just modern. That goes back all the way to the 19th century, to the 1800s. We know it. We've seen it before. Think about all the weird sects that broke out after the left flank of the French Revolution failed. Or the weird sects that broke out even in the United States when the most liberal ends did not happen. To tie this back together and to be specific, no, none of the things I'm going to suggest are socialism, and I'm not pretending that they are. But fixing homelessness is going to be a complicated question. Fixing employment is going to be a complicated question. It's not just a matter of printing money. Where does that money go? We don't have high unemployment. We don't have good employment either. And we don't have most of everything we employ in services and stuff, yet we know we need to make things. It's not that the United States is not a manufacturing economy. It is. It's a very large one. But it doesn't employ that many people in it. And our goals are no longer all that invested in those kind of productive labor. And I don't mean productive in terms of GDP. While GDP tells you something, it also hides a lot. You could have actually a functionally, materially stable society that didn't have GDP growth if all the goods were good and you didn't have, and dead labor wasn't a threat to living labor, aka the stuff built in the past wasn't a threat to making stuff now unprofitable. Right? That profit motivation will always show up in GDP. It does measure something, but it's not going to be something. You could have a society where most of our needs are met that did not grow like that. And I don't mean that in a degrowth paradigm, although I do think we have to deal with that. And that's come up in very real ways in these otherwise ludicrous banana discourse. In a lot of ways, this manifests as like who has the right to labor, but you're always dependent on the labor of others. That's what it means to be a social animal. That's what it means to be human. It's what it means to be most primates, frankly. The question is it mutually beneficial or not? And how do you make it so? So we need a politics that does that. We have to admit that not only do we not have the incentives, politicians clearly don't have the incentives. One of the clearest things, one of the most obvious things about modern society is legislators do not want to take responsibility for anything other than critique. And this leads to them not doing anything when they have power and promising the world when they don't. And this kind of negative engagement has kind of reached an apotheosis on the right with someone like Ron DeSantis. Even more than Trump. But on the left, we don't have a whole lot more either. We have a love of institutions on the liberal side. And on the left side, we have critique, but critique that doesn't change much. But we can talk about how we've had this racial reckoning since Black Lives Matter and there's more representation, which the latter is true, but Black poverty rates are pretty stagnant. Life expectancy for people who are working class has gone down. It hasn't gone down as much for the quote black working class unquote because it was already pretty low. There's been an equalization there, but mostly downward. Anyway, this has been a long rambling thing. I'm going to release it to the public despite my better interest because I think we have to reflect on this. What should we be doing right now and trying to fix things other than trying to promise the world and delivering nothing? How do you, and I say this because I don't believe this is something that you do that's going to make us a socialist country. But there are immediate, like in the classical framework of socialism, there are immediate demands, things that we think have to happen now. Even if we're not administrating capital, which I always think is going to be a disaster. How do we answer these problems now? How do we deal with the fact that we have this crazy ballooned educated strata of society that has no real options? How do we deal with the fact that there's lots of work? In fact, we don't have enough labor, and yet also not a lot of great work. How do we deal with the mental health crisis? How do we deal with guns? How do we deal with violence in society? And a lot of answers we get from the left are totally emotional. We know they're emotional because they're not even bothered to be pitted against each other, that they're mutually contradictory. Right? We want more gun control, but no police. Really? Do you really? Have you thought about what you're saying? Who's going to enforce the gun control? Why pass laws if you don't enforce them? Clearly, we have too many laws, frankly. But yes, we need regulations occasionally, but why have so many? Overregulation leads to bureaucratic drift. All right, that's something the right's not wrong about. And a lot of that just is a cycle that replenishes itself at the expense of other things. If you don't believe me, look at the massive growth of administration, not just in post-secondary school and universities, but also in secondary primary school. It's grown dramatically. It's increased the cost of education dramatically to the point where, like, both the public has to pay more. And they do, by the way. And teachers get less and less of it. So you have just, and there's no incentive for teachers to stay in the classroom. I'm dealing with this personally. Like, there's every incentive for me to go into administration. Now, I deal with that on a level of, development of my personal development, and I deal with it. I think about it a lot and the problems and my own principles. But ask yourself why that is the case, and then try to detangle that administration, because a lot of that administration really is tied up in the things that leftists say they want. And so there's no realistic looking at all that. That's not a politics. Immediate demands have to deal with that. If they have contradictions, you have to admit they're going to be contradictory, or they're not serious. So now that we're several years beyond the burnout, that our Bernie fantasies are over and that our Corbyn fantasies are over, and they have been shown to be fantasies, do we retreat into the rotting corpse of sectarianism? Or do we look at this realistically? What are the immediate demands that we need? What are the orientations that we need? Because that's what a program will be built out of later. What do we need in leadership? How do we control leadership? How do you make it responsive? I don't think these questions are vague. And if I think I want to do something for the small towns I passed through in the beginning of this long monologue, those are the things I have to answer. And you have to answer. And that's larger than just, oh, we just need to build a party. Okay, but the party for what? Run how? With whom? Be more realistic. Because for most of you, let's be honest, politics, it's the same kind of thing as the kind of punk rock aesthetics that people had in less politically motivated times, because you don't have that much effect on either. I'd like to thank my patrons, particularly my Kana and Kahanans. There's some new ones that I'm going to announce. So that will be Devin F. and Slavic Dreams. I would like to remind everyone that if you want more of this thing, that there's plenty beyond the Patreon wall, that I do Q&As there that are just for patrons, etc. But that I keep most of the primary educational stuff free. And I'd like to thank you all for listening. Have a great day.